So picture this. It's 2023. Germany, one of the world's biggest industrial powerhouses, does something that, from the outside, just makes you scratch your head. Right in the middle of a huge energy crisis, it decides to switch off its last three nuclear power plants for good. How in the world do we make sense of that?
I mean, on the face of it, it looks like an act of pure self-sabotage, right? And whenever you see a decision that seems that irrational, it's usually a pretty good sign that the real reasons are buried way, way deeper than everyday politics or economics.
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to dig into the very DNA of Germany's Green Party. And our guide for this whole exploration is the fascinating work of political scientist Dr. Thomas Kessler, who has basically mapped out the entire ideological history of this movement.
So to kick things off, we've got to wrap our heads around the core theory that explains everything else. It really all comes down to the power of ideas themselves. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Dr. Kessler argues that a powerful idea can literally make thousands of people act together, pushing for a shared goal, even when it seems to go against their own immediate interests. It totally shifts the conversation away from policy, spreadsheets and engineering, and toward ideology. It's about the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they believe in.
And look, this isn't just some vague, fuzzy concept. Dr. Kessler builds his entire theory on three solid pillars that show us the whole life cycle of an ideal like this. First, how it takes root inside a single person's mind. Second, how it spreads like wildfire to become a massive social movement. And finally, and this is so important, how that movement builds lasting political structures, like a whole political party, to enforce its beliefs. Okay, so let's go back in time to see how this all got started. To really understand the Green Party's unshakable, die-hard opposition to nuclear power, we've got to travel back to the protest movements of the 1960s and 70s.
So, before the Green Party was even a thought, you had these two totally different movements bubbling up in West Germany. On one side, you had the radical, anti-establishment student movement. And on the other, you had this completely separate wave of local citizens groups, just regular folks worried about the pollution they were seeing in their own backyards. For a long time, they were in completely different universes. Then, the 1970s oil crisis hit, and boom, everything changed. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. You've got the two foundational pillars of what would eventually become the Green Party. On one side, the red route, which was all about a deep critique of capitalism and the state, and on the other, the green route, driven by a much more direct, personal concern for the natural world. They had totally different motivations, but they were about to find one common enemy.
So, how in the world did these two very different groups fuse together to become one of the most powerful anti-nuclear movements on the planet? Well, like in any great story, they needed a villain. They needed a common enemy to unite against.
You have to remember the 1970s were filled with this growing anxiety about all the hidden dangers of modern industry. Oil spills, chemical poisons, all these unseen threats. The absolute genius of the anti-nuclear movement was to take all of that free-floating fear and focus it like a laser onto a single target that perfectly captured those fears, the nuclear power plant. It was complex, its danger was invisible, and it had the terrifying shadow of the atomic bomb looming over it. This wasn't just another environmental issue on a checklist. For this new, combined movement, nuclear energy became the central, defining cause. It was the one single issue that give them a clear purpose, a shared identity, and a dragon to slay. But it wasn't enough to just be against a technology. I mean, that's kind of abstract. To really mobilize people, to get them out on the streets, the movement needed to create a clear human enemy, to give a face to the threat.
And they did this with some incredibly powerful language. Supporters of nuclear energy, we're talking scientists, politicians, industry leaders, they weren't just people with a different opinion. No, they were branded as the Atom Filts, which is sort of like a corrupt network of cronies, or even the Atom Mafia. It was language designed to morally discredit them completely, not to debate them.
And this is the absolutely crucial point. All these individual villains got rolled into one single, powerful, monolithic concept, the Atomstaat, or the atomic state. And all of a sudden, this wasn't a debate about energy policy anymore. It was a heroic battle against a perceived oppressive, all-powerful, and sinister state entity. The movement just relentlessly built this narrative. They linked nuclear power directly to fascism. They would intentionally provoke confrontations at protest sites and then use the images of police and riot gear as proof of this oppressive state they were fighting.
This completely transformed a technical debate into a moral crusade. Being anti-nuclear was no longer just a policy position, it became a core part of your identity as a good person fighting evil.
And this brings us right back to 2023. Because this deep-seated, identity-forming opposition, it didn't just fade away with time. It became permanently encoded right into the Green Party's DNA.
Dr. Kessler argues that the opposition basically evolved into something like a religion, complete with its own ideas of purity and sin. Its central doctrine was something called Restrisiko, or residual risk. This wasn't a scientific assessment, it was a moral absolute. It was the idea that any risk, no matter how statistically tiny, was completely unacceptable. It became a question of faith, not a question of engineering.
And this right here is why all of this history matters so much today. You can draw a direct ideological line from the core beliefs of that original anti-nuclear movement straight to the key themes of modern climate activism. You've got the demand for absolute purity, the critique of economic growth, and that same motivating emotion of a looming apocalypse. The playbook is almost identical. And this is why, when the Green Party, as part of Germany's government, finally shut down those last reactors in 2023, it wasn't some pragmatic decision about the energy grid. It was the final, triumphant chapter in a story that began over 50 years ago. It was, for them, the fulfillment of their founding myth.
The story of Germany's nuclear exit is a powerful lesson in how ideas can shape reality for decades. But it also leaves us with a critical question. In a world now facing the twin crises of climate change and energy security, can an ideology that was forged in the 1970s adapt? Or is it destined to just repeat its own history?